everybody knows that's not true. He's one of the people that's going through this in 1651. God knows what's going on over here. Because after all, would God ever do anything that wasn't just? So you see the revolution in attitudes of modernity versus pre-modernity over here. But then he also finds, as we do in Tisha B'Av, strands within the Torah and within the Torah tradition to argue the other way around. That suffering doesn't necessarily mean that God is punishing someone because he doesn't like them. We have a concept that God punishes those he loves and holds them to a tougher standard. Here we are with none of an Avihu. That's what we're talking about. Were they punished, or was their death of none of Avihu a sign of their great sanctity and righteousness? This whole thing goes back and forth. He's deploying it in trying to deal with what happened to this Holocaust in 1648. Again, he quotes from various sources which say the exact same thing, that none of an Avihu and people like that, that by striking the righteous for minor infractions, you see the justice of God brought forth in its full majesty. And there's no trouble saying that. And we have a concept also of a certain vicarious punishment. And here you have Rabbi Wasserman said when he was shot, he said, we're dying for the American Jews. Remember such an idea? So there's this kind of thing. That's how he ends the book. He doesn't end it on a glorious note because he was living right in the middle of these tragedies. So there's no question that the overall theme of the Jews at that time was not one of this kind of, psychological eating away that we found in the post-Holocaust period. I mean, my parents went through a war. I know this all firsthand. So, the idea of why did this happen and all that. We know why it happened. It's an attitude which lets you, move on with life, and that certainly was very, powerful theme at that time. Wait a second. He says, it's also true that mipnei chatainu means for our sins. He speaks about it in very general terms, but it's also true, as we see nowadays, that Bernie was alluding to, I think, that there's always those people who want to say, if it was due to our sins, we can find which sins they were. There are people today that'll tell you what were the sins of the Holocaust or something, right? Well, at that time it's the same thing. And so the rabbis in Poland had different opinions about this. And it boils down to what do you call the sin du jour? What is the big Avera? Because no one claimed, at least as far as I can tell, that they knew from heaven what the reason is. Well, yes and no. One of the martyrs that I mentioned last week was Rav Shimshon Oster-Poler, very famous Makubal, who was held in such esteem that he was, held like the Arizal or something, that, he really did get nevuah of a certain type. Whether he was told by a Maggid or some other heavenly force, it doesn't matter how you call it, but they don't use the word nevuah, but that's what it boils down to. You have a direct phone line upstairs. And they said, it's not written, but they said, and that's the trouble, it goes by rumors, that he said that it was talking in shul. Right? Which was a big theme picked up by the Tosas Yontif, who was one of the big rabbis in Poland at that particular time. The Tosas Yontif was a German rabbi who had moved 20 years earlier from Germany, where things are really tough, to Poland. I mean, he had been in Prague and gotten in trouble with the local Balabatim because he wanted to reform the Jewish tax system because it favored the rich over the poor. Surprise, surprise. And so he had to hightail it into Poland, where he also got in trouble because he said that the big sins that we have today are two in number, and eventually conflated them for the purpose of assigning the fault of the Holocaust. To put in plain English, one problem is talking in shul. The other problem is corrupt rabbis. Right? The Beis Dins and the Rabbanim and all this, it's a bought office. It's an elite system where it's old boy network. It's everybody puts in their relatives and their in-laws or something like that, son-in-law, and you know how it goes. The result was like this: one group said it's your fault, the other group said it's your fault. So, as is famous, and we have here in the shul, somebody gave many years ago, over there where I'm pointing with my pointer, is the famous Mishaberach that they attribute. We're not 100% sure if it's from him, but they attribute to the Tosis Yontif in the Mishaberach for not talking in shul. And even though it'll seem to some people like a little thing, it's a big thing. It's a big avera. It's not a little avera. It has to do in general with the idea of people not feeling that a Beis HaKnesset is a Malkum Kaddish. They feel like they can act however they want. And the Jews at that time had no trouble assigning all these horrors that I described to you in great detail to things like that. Right? Notice he said, these are the sins of the generations. But that's not the only one. One of the famous preachers at that time in Poland, he's not so well known today, was Rabbi Berach. It was actually a father and a son. And these two guys were like, Billy Graham. It was fire and brimstone. But they were very strident social critics. Everybody loved to hear him and everybody hated to hear him. The reason they loved to hear him, they're fantastic speakers. The reason they hated to hear him is because he told like it was. You understand? And by the time he got finished, all the rich people and all the powerful and all the others in the audience were like things. So he's always, on the move. He never could stay in a place at one time. It was too unpopular, even though they invited him back later on. And he says, I found it somewhere, that he lists in his speeches, he says, he lives right through this period. He says, you know why all this Holocaust happened? You got the following averas: breeding of pigs. So that means that, Jews, that's right. Listen, I told you, all these guys were involved in the economy over here in the Ukraine. That means that these Jewish agents ran hundreds of miles sometimes, full of farms and peasants and whole provinces. And what can I tell you? Money's money, and it is what it is. So he said, breeding of pigs, Machal Shabbos, by the terms at that time, davening without kavanah, false interpretations of the Torah by darshanim. This is a darshan speaking. That's quite a punishment for that. The sale of rabbinical positions even to those qualified, meaning that the way it went was the position of the communal rabbi was bought. This eventually just became the way it was in Poland. There was no way you could get around it. After a while, the local lords, the magnates who ruled the area, always insisted that they be paid off if anybody's going to be the rabbis. Then it becomes a question of which side can come up with the more money, and you can imagine how dirty that gets. It's very famous. And Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz, 100 years later, was offered to be the Rav in Krakow, a position he was born there, but he didn't take the job. They told him, he says, they write this. They say, we've already bribed the local duke. You don't have to worry about all that. It's been taken care of. That's how much we hold of you. You understand? And there was, I forget who, it shows how rare it was, some rabbi who were a sefer in the 1700s in Poland, and he says, you won't believe this. I got the job without paying a penny, and nobody had to be bribed, everything like this. It's everybody's wondering how it happened. This is the result of a society in which, all the Jews everywhere are under the rule of these magnates, and therefore it's money. The only reason they're allowed there is for the money. And so the rabbinate becomes part of that. The luxurious clothing, and these are only some of the sins that were the causes. And he called for the immediate tikkun of all these terrible sins. So, wow. Point is, nobody knew exactly. They're all looking for what they considered the sins of the time. And today, people would be offended, I would, if they say, I know what a Holocaust happened because people did this in Russia or Poland or Germany or something like that. I consider that to be crazy. But they didn't at that time. Right? The people we're speaking to had a different sensibility, and therefore their reaction to this Holocaust was quite different than the ones that we're seeing over here. So, as I say, you didn't have the Elie Wiesel kind of attitude, except a little bit. When I say a little bit, you find the Shach of all people, who was the biggest rabbi at that time, or one of the biggest, among other things, wrote a long poem describing in gruesome detail, paralleling what I've read you before. It's called the Megillas Ephah. I'm not going to read it because it's too long. Where he goes for page after page. I think about 15 pages or so of a long poem, which rhymes, in which he goes through all these kinds of gzeros that we were talking about over here. I mean, just to give you the shortest, a brief passage of it. He says, Kama me'os tova b'mayim b'chol mi'ni surim koshim. He talks about the people who were drowned by the enemy in the water and all kind of terrible tortures. Basic Knesset Fnei Aron Kodesh HaKadoshim, Shachtu b'chalafas ha'misham b'chazar masham, and how they went in front of the base, right over here, in front of the Aron Kodesh, and they shechted the chazan and the choirs. So you see, you used to have choirs at that time, and the shamashim, and this and this and this. So see, called Sifrei Torah Sishon Chadoshim, and they pulled out wherever they went all the Sefer Torahs out of the Aron Kodesh, and they ripped them to shreds and trampled on them for man animals, the horses and cavalrymen. And made them into shoes and sandals. And they on purpose, out of anger, took the Hebrew books and the Sefer Torahs and turned the ksav, the writing, onto the floor so they could stamp one over here. No, there was a lot of atavistic kind of animal-like hatred that they displayed, in addition to killing people and doing all the other types of things. So he goes in all these kinds of details. People like the Shach echo a little bit what you find in some of the keynotes that we're about to recite on Tisha B'Av, in which you have, as what I call this Eli Wiesel kind of phenomenon, which is, where are you, God? How come this happened? Why'd you let it go? You see? Not a lot, because they're still believers and they're religious Jews. That's an understatement, Shach. But nevertheless, you see the evidence of your eyes and you say, because, listen, we have this tradition, again, that we're going to recite in 2 days, in Judaism, where the 10 martyrs are killed, the 10 great rabbis, Rabbi Akiva and the others, I'm talking about, right? And the angels complain to God. Isn't that right? They say, Zu Torah v'zu schara. This is a well-known trope, meaning this isn't something that's outside of our tradition. The Malachim are challenging this, and God just says to them, this is Zerahim Elfonai, you just shut up. This is beyond you. So, okay, but we understand that the angels are moved when they see Rabbi Akiva being tortured, so that means we can. And therefore, as I say before, when at a certain limit, you'll find people like the Shach and the Tosas Yontav and people like this of the highest religiosity saying, how could this happen to Poland? All these yeshivas, all these people, how could you, why didn't you stop them? This is what should have happened. They should have opened their own Kodesh and been struck with lightning. And none of that happened. So these are the kinds of, as I say, reactions on the religious level that emerge out of here. And for this reason, there will not be, this is a controversial position in the historiographies, I'll try to explain a little bit later. I don't think there really was a long-term psychological trauma of the Polish Jews. They were able to fit it within a certain theological framework, and we know it happened, and now let's move on with life, because that's all you can do. There is nothing else that you can do. Right? That's exactly what I'm going to disagree with. That's exactly where I'm going. That's exactly what I'm going to disagree with. On the other hand, what's interesting is that they wanted to make a Yom HaShoah. That they felt they should do. Or let's put it this way. The Shach, who I repeat, was pretty much, even though he was young, he was in his 20s. He was born in 1622 and he died in 1663. So he was 41 or 40 when he died. So here's somebody who's in his 20s. What's 1640? That would be, he's 26 years old when the Xeris Takvatat hits. But by that time he was, as we would say today, a published author. He was already a gigantic gaon and held in the highest renown. And he says over here himself, at the end of this very long poem, he says, Al kain kovati liatzmi uludorosai levonim b'nei bonim. Therefore I have established, at least for my kids, for my family. I'm not telling someone else what to do, but I'm telling you what I'm doing in my family. Yom tzom v'tainis ve'evel misik b'kinim. We're going to have a private Yom HaShoah, at least in my family. Okay, a day of mourning and fasting and all that. B'yom chaf l'chodesh Sivan, and I'm picking for my family to do it on the 20th of Sivan. Shebo nitna Torah yikar mipninim. The month of Sivan is the month where the Torah was given. After all, that's the month of Shavuos. But you and I know it's also the month where all these massacres happened in Nemirov and Tolshin and all these other places that we talked about. And it's also when the Crusades hit, and it's also, as you'll see again, V'yata Krua Pura'u Goyim Rabbi Hamonim Monim, and now once again the Torah has been ripped to shreds, as literally, not only figuratively too, but literally ripped to shreds during this month. This again, it plays on a well-known theme. Those who will remember from the Kinos, the famous poem of the Maam Rottenberg, Shali Sruf of Eish, where he looks at the burning of the Torah by the church in Paris in 1244 or so, where he was present, and he says, "Is this why the Torah was given in the month of Sivan? So it should be burned at that time." So the horrible dissonance between the ideal on the one hand and the reality on the other, is poetically presented. But why does he say, "I want to do the Chaf Sivan"? This was the day when the massacre started, right? So apparently he knew. And it's also a day that's been bad luck in Jewish history, like Tisha B'Av. It's a day that has repeated bad things happen on the same day. Now this was the day that Nemirov was killed. On the 20th of Sivan, that was the first massacre, unfortunately they were alive, that we spoke about in great detail. That's when the Cossacks pretended to be attacking and got into the city under false flags and all that sort of thing. Now, why was it a day that is, like Tisha B'Av, repeated bad things that happen in history? Kigam Gzeris Tas Kala Hoisa B'Yomahu Ba'osun Azmanim, because the terrible decree or persecution of 1171, Taf Taf Chuf Lamed Aleph, happened on that day, and V'gam Ki Yom Zeh Lo Yer B'Shabbos Kodesh Shum Panim. And I also calculated in the calendar, Chaf Sivan never falls out on a Saturday, so you won't have to worry about that. Al Pi HaKfiyah Saluchos should be based on the calendar. V'chibarti Slichos V'tachnunim, and therefore I wrote all these Slichos. So what does that mean? The 20th of Sivan was a day of a famous anti-Semitic incident in France in the time of the Rabbeinu Tam and the Bali Tosus in 1170. It's actually one of the very first blood libels. The basic facts go like this. On the testimony of a Christian servant of the mayor, a Judeophobe, the Jews of Blois, as you say, in France, the Jews of Blois were accused of having crucified a Christian child for Pesach and having thrown the body into the river. Now, at that time, the Jews in France were like Poland. Generally speaking, things were pretty good in France. This was the period of Rashi and Bali Tosus. Things got real bad in France after 1189, but prior to that, the Jews had it